Just Like Buffalo is the brilliant 23rd episode of the first season of Two and a Half Men. It's actually the penultimate episode of the first season, which is pretty crazy that we only have one episode left. And this is another episode where I couldn't remember the specifics because it's been a long time since I last saw it, but the memories started to come back to me as I watched it, and I really thoroughly enjoyed it. This was directed by Rob Schiller, and there will be spoilers from now as I go through various aspects of the narrative. And it starts off with Charlie prepping the house, throwing around a bunch of Jake's stuff because he wants his latest date to think that he's great with kids. And he says some pretty derogatory stuff, and Jake overhears this. And despite those remarks, it's still a pretty funny introduction. Jake keeps forgetting his school stuff, and then ultimately he tries to leave the house without his shoes. And it's a pretty good start. And then Alan drops Jake off at Judith's house, and her support group is there. And we have these women who have clearly all been divorced or separated recently, and Jake repeats some of the stuff that Charlie said. And this episode, more than most in the first season, is where I can really see Angus T. Jones's perspective. I don't want to go into this too much, but a lot of the reason why Angus T. Jones left the show, as far as I'm aware, is because of how filthy the show is, but also the fact that he's a very young child at this point, having to learn about a lot of things he shouldn't really know about. And I have a couple of examples to discuss as we go through this episode. And certainly when Jake is repeating a lot of the things that Charlie is saying, it must be kind of awkward to have a 10-year-old or 11-year-old, I don't know how old he was when he was performing this, but saying those things. And that does come up a few times throughout. And obviously Judith is really annoyed that Charlie has instilled these thoughts in her son as well. Judith does take things into her own hands, and I don't agree with this, but she sends Jake to a friend's house when Alan is supposed to be coming over the following weekend to collect him for his custody time. And they do have, as Alan pointed out, they have a custody agreement, and Judith has broken that. And she's not actually allowed to do that, assuming it was an agreement made with the courts. And while Alan is there, all of these women start to say things to him, and it's a really uncomfortable situation for him to be in. And the following morning, Saturday morning, it's a really emotional scene, because I imagine it's actually something a lot of parents can relate to. It doesn't get too heavy within the episode, but certainly if there's that element of relatability, it must be pretty heavy going, because it's Saturday morning and Charlie comes down for pancakes. There are no pancakes because Alan makes them for Jake. And then Berta comes in, and then Rose comes in, and Evelyn comes in, and they're all there looking for Jake and kind of pancakes. Well, Berta's come round to work, but she's still surprised that Jake's not there. Not necessarily as surprised that it's Charlie's fault. And there's this brilliant moment where Berta and Rose and Evelyn are all standing side by side just staring at Charlie. And I just thought it was a really fantastic moment. So even though it could have been quite a heavy scene about a father who wasn't allowed to see his son, it ended up being entertaining still because of the comedy being there right when it needed to be. And interestingly, and I love this bit, it's beautifully done, Charlie goes over to Judith's house, and I am now questioning the timeline. I said that the following morning was the pancakes, but now I'm wondering if Alan collected Jake early on in the morning on Saturday, which would explain why the support group was still there. That might be the case. And either way, he goes over there, the support group are there, and he begins to sweet talk them. And yes, you could analyse this as a man manipulating the responses of the women by playing up to their emotional needs. But at the same time, I'd like to think of it as an uncle who's desperate to make amends and allow his brother to see his son. So, depending on how you want to look at it, it could be a really positive thing, it could be a really negative thing. And ultimately, the support group end up going back to Charlie's house, and they're having a great time. And Judith actually made me laugh at this point, because what ultimately happens is she brings Jake over because she wants her friends back. When Charlie asks her if she wants to stay for some wine, there's that moment where she's going to refuse, and then she just gives in and has wine. And we have this wonderful moment where Judith lets her guard down and allows herself to have a good time at Charlie's house. We don't obviously see very much of that, but it was a very, very interesting moment that I rather enjoyed. And then the final scene, the closing scene, is one of those scenes that I'd mentioned before where I can understand the perspective that Angus T. Jones was perhaps being exposed to more than he should have been. Because obviously, this is an episode about Jake being exposed to things he shouldn't be at a young age. But then we have to remember that there is an actor behind the character who is also being exposed to this. And in this final scene, they're discussing Charlie's little head. And Jake doesn't understand because Charlie's got a normal sized head. And the grown-ups, Charlie and Alan, are trying to work out if they should explain it to him. But it makes me wonder just how much Angus T. Jones knew. And did he understand the reference? And if he didn't understand the reference, it's reasonable that he would then try and find out what it means. So while I don't necessarily think that the show should have been boycotted or that it's a terrible show for doing this, I do, completely understand this idea that the show was delivering too much information to such a young child. I don't know if you have any thoughts on that, please feel free to let me know, but certainly this is one of those episodes where a lot of the discussions were with Jake in the scene. Often a lot of the sordid information, if you like, is done when Jake is off camera. He might still be in the vicinity, so it's still not amazing, but he might not have been in the scene at the time. But occasionally, with episodes like this, sometimes that information is unavoidable for the young actor at the time. So I can understand certain viewpoints, but it's still a very funny show. So I mean, it's a little bit awkward, I guess. But if you have any strong thoughts on that, please feel free to let me know. But as an episode, just like Buffalo, is really brilliant and a pretty great penultimate episode for the first season.